please join me again in acknowledging the engaged and very thoughtful work of these young scholars. We'd also like to open up the floor for your comments and questions to the panelists. Don't be shy.
Should we just go? Yes. Shelby, my question's for you. So I think it's great, you talk about how the board, the Burning Man organization is really hegemonic. And in part that's also just as the size of Burning Man has grown over time. Right now we're talking about 60,000 people. It's kind of a lot of people and so on and so forth. But I wonder if do you find it hopeful though that so many people want the Burning Man experience? As in, do you find it hopeful that so many people want an experience that's anti the default mode, even if that experience is in so many ways illusory or hegemonic?
Thank you for the question. I find it, it's definitely, partly a positive thing that so many people want to go to Burning Man, and I know that probably the majority of them, the ones that haven't been, have a certain idea of it in their heads, which is the whole anti-establishment, free, liberal connotation that comes with it. So it's definitely a hopeful quality for people to want to participate in that. And I think the only reason I find it maybe a little negative is because I feel like a lot of people that want to go because of so much of the hype that's surrounding it, especially lately because it's been selling out the past couple of years. And I just wonder how many of them actually, even know the principles or think about how they can apply somewhere else other than just at a party. So partially hopeful, partially not. Just like Burning Man is partially.
Please.
I have a question. With Burning Man, the last couple of years they have allowed the public tour buses to go in and photograph people on the playa like they're, in the zoo. What's your thoughts on selling out to outsiders for, I think for money? I think they sell tickets for tourists, non-burners to go and exploit the whole ritual experience. What's your thoughts on that?
Thank you for the question. I did touch on this briefly in my paper. I think it's been the past maybe of recent 3 or 4 years, buses come in from the city, from Fernley or from Carson City, and they just drive around and look at Burning Man and look at all the burners, and it's it's weird because they're just whoa, look at all those crazy people dancing around, and I've talked to a couple people about it. It definitely makes them feel a little their privacy has been violated. And then there's these new development of plug and play camps where people pay other people a couple $1,000s to go to the playa and set up their tents and bring their costumes, bring their food, do everything, and they just come for the weekend basically just to party. And my self-reflexive thought on both of these is that, to me, I look at them and I say oh, they're tourists and they're just watching us and they're not really helping the community. But then I also was offended when members of the DPW, the people who work for the board, called me a tourist. So it's sort of these layers of belonging that we all sort of belong on Yeah.
So a question for Caroline. Did you find, when you were researching, did you find that the rates of medication and diagnoses fell amongst like homeschooled Americans? And then part two of that question, is this a parallel experience in other educational models in Europe and Asia?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, I only focused on public education in my research paper in the U.S., so I didn't see many models outside of the U.S. And homeschooling, because I just felt that because public education is so highly populated with students in the U.S., that was the most important for me to look at as a researcher. That's a very interesting thing to look into, if the different structural environment of a home or public education would affect the diagnosis and medication. So thank you, that's another thing.
Well, I guess, can I follow it up with another question then? Do you think that the problem surrounding this is more systemic of American models of medication and capitalism, or the current neoliberal educational models that we have? Or can you even separate those?
I do not think you can separate them. That would be my answer. I think that there are even many more kind of sources to this problem than what I have presented, and that's, I completely acknowledge that I did not go into every route that you could with this topic. And I think to really understand the underlying issue that we need to fix, you need to look at it from multiple angles.
Thank you.
I have a question for Carolyn. And kind of in context with, I was very impressed with your presentation in relation to Terry's. And I was curious in terms of the research you did and thinking in a historic perspective, and do you think that the use of these medications is our contemporary institutional response to what in past times have been more ideological? You know, where children and citizens were kind of mentally impressed with the common ideology, you know, through the church, through the system. And if we're just now using chemistry instead of and if there isn't a direct connection between all of these millions of followers of Paul and these people, that was sort of maybe.
No, I never thought of that, and that is very interesting to think about. I know that there was kind of a rise in diagnosis and medication of ADHD in I think it was the 60s or 70s, and then it dipped back down again because people were really anxious about how many children were diagnosed with this. And then once the 90s hit, it started to steadily rise back up again. So I guess it would be very interesting to look at the different ideological changes that happened around those times that would affect the increase of the diagnosis and eventually medication.
That's interesting what you said about the 60s and 70s. I can relate to that.
Thank you.
We weren't particularly worried about attention deficit. Thank you for
Yeah, I was just wondering, and this kind of relates to Shelby and Joe's lecture or papers, is there kind of almost like a tipping point, you guys think, where, you know, once a space or a populace reaches a certain size or reaches a certain, you know, quantity, that hegemony, you know, is bound to happen, or it becomes a lot easier or probable to happen? Because it seems like, you know, both of these events start growing to a point where they need like a centralized, you know, power, I guess. And
in short, yes. I would say that there's no set equilibrium. You can't quantify a sort of point where you cross a threshold and things really start to change. But this is an issue that those of us who are involved in any sort of horizontal or anarchist-inspired organization, whether it's political or otherwise, that's something that when groups tend to grow larger, you start to see these sort of pressure points. I like to call them that, because essentially what happened, this is what feminist scholar named Joe Friedman coined this term, the tyranny of structurelessness. Where if you just have like radical inclusion, like what Shelby talks about in her paper, when an organization or group, especially if it's politically minded, gets to a certain size, it just begins to reflect the dominant and oppressive ideologies imbued in the larger society in which it functions. So some of the steps that people at Occupy took, just because I'm familiar with it, to sort of mitigate these things are to create what's known as a spokes council, which is essentially a model where a small, very small affinity group has a voice for whatever their sort of focus is, and they pick one person from within their group to represent them in an assembly, instead of just having a free-for-all general assembly when there's like 30 people in line to speak, because that's just not practical. So that can be a very good way to mitigate these things, but that's one of the core questions of how these movements can proliferate beyond a certain point. And then you have to deal with the cops. So, I don't know, that's my perspective on it.
My question is for Brett. With the canceling of soap operas, do you see parallel demonizing effects of gays in reality shows? Or do you see any sort of correlation to reality shows to soap operas and soap operas that are out?
Thank you for your question. I have to say, within the context of my paper itself, I didn't look very closely at reality television. I confess to not necessarily being a fan of reality television. So I can't answer directly. I can say that I do think that there's a lot about soap operas as a genre that mirror other forms of popular culture entertainment, including reality television. And so, yes, I do believe that you would see these same patterns represented in these different places. Yeah.
We have time for one more. I know there's lots of hands where we can go into the assembly afterwards.
I'm a very optimistic educator, and I want to comment and really congratulate all the panelists today. Many of you know that we have Common Core content standards in the country, about 46 states and adopted those. And the content standards were written kind of backwards from what colleges expect anticipated their graduates. The ability to analyze, to argue, to synthesize information. And I think all the panelists did such a wonderful job of that, touching on so many different disciplines, that this cultural studies program should be celebrated and should be publicized, because you are doing exactly what we in the K-12 sector say we need to prepare students to do. So I really want to